Alright, so tonight we're going to be talking about the evidence for the resurrection. My name is Sarah Heath. I'm a student here. Before we start, so what is the big deal about the resurrection? Why do you guys think it matters so much, and is it really that important to Christianity? So you can talk with your neighbors for a second, and we're going to get back together and see what you guys think.
It's pretty important.
Yeah.
Huh?
Paul says that it rises to fall.
Yeah.
Without that, Christianity wouldn't be right?
It's like,
Wait, what do you
that
mean?
was what made
Obviously, you guys
start preaching the gospel. That was what
feel about it?
I mean, they still, like, believe that it's men, but like, that's what
Okay, so what are some of y'all's thoughts? Yeah, Marianne?
I think it's the crux of our faith.
Yeah, I would agree. Anybody else? Yeah, she had it pretty good. Alright, so the truth of Christianity hinges on the resurrection. Christians claim that Jesus rose from the dead and is God and died for our sins. He defeated sin and death and is now seated in heaven with the Father. But if the resurrection did not happen, then this all falls apart. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, then he is not who he claimed to be, and he did not do what he claimed to do, and he is not alive now, and we are not saved from our sins. So it's pretty important. And as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:14, and if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. So if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then our faith is useless, and our time spent believing in Jesus, praying to him, worshiping him, is all in vain. So the implications of this are really big, and if the resurrection did not happen, we are to be pitied among all people, as Paul says later in that chapter. So the truth of Christianity hinges on the resurrection. The central message of the gospel is that Jesus had died for our sins and has risen from the dead. Because of this, we can now be reconciled to God, and all of our sins can be forgiven when we place our trust in him. But if the resurrection did not happen, then the core of Christianity crumbles, and Christianity cannot be true. So the resurrection is absolutely essential to Christianity. Now I'll have you guys read some if we want to start on this side and go over. But Jesus also says the resurrection is proof of who he is. So Marianne, if you want to read this passage from Matthew to show that.
Sure. Matthew 12:38 through 40. Then some of the Pharisees and teachers of the law said to him, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." He answered, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but none will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth."
Are you guys familiar with the story of Jonah? Okay. Anybody want to summarize it really quick for us?
He got ate by a big fish
Yeah.
out of rebellion of God's plan.
Right, so God told him to go to Nineveh, and he tried to run away, and he ended up getting in a ship to run away, and there was a big storm. They threw him off the ship because he caused the storm. Then a big fish followed him, and 3 days later spit him out, and he preached in Nineveh. And so Jesus is saying this is his sign, that he is who he is, and this is the one sign. And of course he did a lot of other miracles as well, but this is the sign that shows who Jesus is and who he claimed to be, that it actually is who he is. And we also see in Acts the resurrection is a central message taught by the early church. So the resurrection is the test of Christianity. In the passage we read from 1 Corinthians, we see that Paul and Jesus are offering a test of Christianity. So Christianity is a falsifiable religion, which is unique. Most religions don't have this kind of standard by which we can judge if they're true or not. You just choose to believe them or not believe them. But Paul gives us a test to see if Christianity is true. So if you can show that Jesus did not rise from the dead, then you have proven Christianity false. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, and his teachings are true, and his claims that he made about himself are also true, which proves Christianity true. So as we've seen, the resurrection has really big implications for our life. So if we're going to believe it, we should have good reasons for believing it. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So what is the evidence? Can we actually prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead? So one of the best arguments, in my opinion, for the resurrection is the minimal facts approach. This was developed by Gary Habermas while he was writing his PhD dissertation. He is a well-known and respected American historian and New Testament scholar. He spent 30 years cataloging the positions of historical Jesus teaching scholars, whether agnostic, atheist, Jewish, Christian, etc. He read everything published about the historical Jesus in scholarly journals and monographs written in French, English, or German, and he noticed that over some matters, over 90% of scholars were unanimous. And while considering these facts, he realized they were best explained by Jesus' resurrection. Every other explanation either ignored or strained some of the facts surrounding Jesus' death. So the minimal facts approach presents historical facts agreed on by nearly all scholars, and it argues the best explanation of these facts is the resurrection. It also does not assume the inerrancy or divine inspiration of a New Testament document, rather it just holds them to be historical documents penned during the 1st century AD. And of course, as Christians, we do believe the Bible is the Word of God, and there's good reason for that, but this approach is a great way to share with somebody who's not a Christian already why we do believe the resurrection happened. So there's 2 requirements that Gary Habermas used for his facts. The first is that each must be confirmed by several strong and independent arguments, plus the vast majority of even critical scholars must recognize the occurrence's historical nature. The critical scholars can be liberal, skeptical, agnostic, or even atheist, as long as they are specialists in a relevant field of study such as the New Testament. So Gary Habermas has 6 facts. We're going to just look at 3 of them tonight. We don't have time for all of them, but he has 6 facts, and these are his. 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. 2, very soon afterwards, his followers had real experiences that they thought were actual appearances of the risen Jesus. 3, that their lives were transformed as a result, even to the point of being willing to die specifically for the faith in the resurrection message. 4, that these things were taught very early, soon after the crucifixion. 5, that James, Jesus' unbelieving brother, became a Christian due to his own experiences that he thought was the resurrected Christ. And then 6, that the Christian persecutor Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus, also became a believer after a similar experience. Any questions so far? Okay. So Mike Licona kind of boils this down to 3 facts and simplifies it a little bit. So we're going to be focusing on these tonight and using these to prove the resurrection. His first fact is Jesus died by crucifixion. 2 is very soon afterwards, Jesus' disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the resurrected Jesus. And 3, people who were not followers of Jesus truly believed the risen Jesus had appeared to them. So when a historian is looking at a historical event, they go through all the data, consider all the possibilities, and seek to determine which scenario best explains the data. And that's what we're going to be doing tonight. We're going to look at the historical data about the resurrection that pretty much all scholars agree on, and then we're going to figure out which explanation best fits the data we have. One thing that's also important to understand is that non-Christian scholars also use the New Testament. As Gary Habermas explains, one secret not readily known is that these skeptical scholars are quite willing to cite New Testament text in order to buttress the historical nature of these 6 events. While not believing that these passages are inspired or even generally reliable, they still employ the individual texts that meet their standards of evidence. It is largely from these passages, plus occasionally from extra New Testament writings, that they find plenty of data to accept these half a dozen facts. So, what is the implication of these facts? As William Lane Craig explains, if these facts can be established and no plausible natural explanation can account for them, as well as the resurrection hypothesis, then one is justified in inferring Jesus' resurrection as the most plausible explanation of the data. So, we're going to start by examining the facts. So our first fact is Jesus died by crucifixion. So why do you guys think that might be so strongly supported by all the scholars? Yeah?
But it was done by Romans.
Yeah, Romans did it. What does that imply?
They were reliable at killing people.
Right, yeah. So very good at killing people. Yeah?
It's mentioned by secular historians.
Right, that's a good one too. Anything else? Okay. So first, of course, we have the New Testament. We know that Jesus was crucified both from Christian and non-Christian sources, and then the most obvious one is the New Testament. The New Testament is composed of 27 different books written by 9 different authors. Each of these authors believe that Jesus died and rose from the dead. So just in the New Testament, we have 9 different authors saying Jesus did in fact die on the cross. But we're going to look at some non-biblical sources as well that support this. Our first one is Tacitus. He is a Roman historian. Would you mind reading that for us?
Nero fastened the guilt on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, and again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome.
Okay, so this passage is talking about Nero's decision to blame the Christians for the fire that destroyed Rome in 64 AD. Tacitus reports that Christians got their name from a historical person called Christus from the Latin, or Christ. He is said to have suffered the extreme penalty, referring to the Roman method of execution, which is crucifixion. This occurred during the reign of Tiberius and by the sentence of Pontius Pilate. This confirms much of what the Gospels tell us about the death of Jesus, and we also learn from Tacitus that Christians were persecuted and hated to some extent. Tacitus was not Christian, and he did not like Christians, which explains why he used the phrase mischievous superstition. But he gives us enemy testimony that admits certain facts about Jesus and Christians. Next we have Josie. Yes?
Why is the fact that it's enemy testimony relevant?
Yeah, good question. So enemies don't really want to help your case. So if you're like an enemy of Christianity, you're not going to want to support them. And so if enemies and Christians both agree on the same thing, they're probably true, because they're not going to say something that's not true to help Christians. So if they're both saying Jesus was crucified, it's probably true. Does that make sense? Okay. Kennedy, will you read Josephus' quote for us?
Yeah. At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. Those who had become his disciples did not abandon their loyalty to him. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, they believed that he was the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders, and the tribe of the Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day.
Thank you. Does anybody know who Josephus is? Yeah?
He was a Jewish scholar person, or historian.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So he was one of the greatest Jewish historians of all time, and he lived from 36 AD to 100 AD. And one of his most famous works is Antiquities of the Jews, and he finishes about AD 93. Jesus died in 33 AD, so it was pretty soon after Jesus died, and this was one of the quotes in there. And so from him we learn that Jesus was known to be wise and virtuous. He had disciples. He was crucified under Pilate. He died, and his followers claimed to see him alive 3 days after he was crucified. They believed he was the Messiah, and he was not a Christian. And as a side note, there are some other versions of this quote that seem like they have been changed by Christians. And they say like things like he was the Messiah, which a Jew wouldn't have said, but this quote is probably what he actually said. And you have the Talmud. Chrissy, do you want to read that for us?
Sure.
Okay.
On the eve of the Passover, Yeshu was hanged for 40 days before the execution took place. A herald cried, he is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and hence enticed Israel to paticity. The Talmud, I'm actually really not good at my English. Talmud is a Jewish religious word.
Thank you.
So what if they are Jewish? So what? Just they would know.
What?
So what if they are Jewish? Like, oh no, they wouldn't.
What do you mean?
It's just a Jewish word.
Yeah, I'm just telling you what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Jews weren't Christians, just to kind of point out, like it's from a non-Christian
Jesus
source.
is not a
basically.
Christian?
What?
Is Jesus not a Christian or something? Wait, you mentioned something about like someone's not a Christian or like.
So like before Jesus or before he came to the earth, like they had like the Jewish religion, and kind of after he died and was crucified, Christians broke off, but he started that basically.
Wait, like when he was alive, he wasn't like labeled as a Christian. Like.
He would have been called Jewish in his life, but he didn't agree with a lot of the Jewish rulers at that
So
time.
why is it called Christianity then? It should be called, you guys should be Jewish. Wait, I actually did not know that. I'm sorry. Like,
You're good,
I
you're
legit,
good.
like, so
Yeah.
Jesus was never a Christian. Did he even know what Christian was?
Yeah, so-
Well,
Yeah.
How about we go into this in
Christianity
detail
wasn't
after this?
used to
Okay, that sounds
describe
good.
it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Because it's- no, you're good. It's an incredibly interesting question.
Yeah, we can talk about it
Yeah,
more.
I'll talk about it after the meeting.
Okay. Good question, though. Okay, so the Talmud is a Jewish religious work. The Jews did not believe Jesus was the Messiah or that he rose from the dead, which is one of the differences in Jews and Christianity. The Jewish religious leaders saw Jesus as a threat, and they were the ones who demanded him to be crucified. But even though they were enemies of Jesus, we can still get some facts about Jesus' life from the Talmud that agree with what the New Testament writers said. And so Yeshua, or Yeshua, is how Jesus' name is pronounced in Hebrew, and the term hanged can function as a synonym for crucified. We see this in the New Testament as well. For example, in Galatians 3:13, it declares that Christ was hanged, and Luke 23:39 also applies this term to the criminals who were crucified with Jesus. And then the cry of the herald, Jesus was to be stoned. This can probably be explained by that people did want to stone Jesus, which we also see in the New Testament as well. And this passage also tells us why Jesus was crucified. It claims he practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Since the accusation comes from a hostile source, we shouldn't be surprised if Jesus is described somewhat differently than what we see in the New Testament. But what do these charges actually imply about Jesus?
He existed
Yeah.
and was crucified.
Yeah, some kind
Yeah.
of supernatural element to him, the practicing sorcery part.
Right. These accusations actually have close parallels in the Gospels. For example, the charge of sorcery is similar to the Pharisees' accusation that Jesus cast out demons by Beelzebul, the rulers of demons. By this kind of charge, it actually tends to confirm the New Testament claims that Jesus performed miracles. Apparently, his miracles were too well attested to deny, and so they couldn't deny them. The only alternative was to ascribe them to sorcery instead. Likewise, the charge of enticing Israel to apostasy parallels Luke's account of Jewish leaders who accused Jesus of misleading the nation with his teachings. This kind of charge supports the New Testament record of Jesus' powerful teaching ministry. We also have Lucian. He was a 2nd century Greek satirist. In one of his works, he wrote the following about Christians. Will you mind reading that, Luke?
Sure. The Christians you know worship a man to this day, a distinguished person, what is that?
Personage.
Personage,
Yeah.
who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property.
Thank you. So this quote shows us that Christians worshipped a man who was crucified and that they denied their gods. So all of these sources are non-Christian sources that tell us about Jesus. From them we learn that Jesus was in fact crucified. Historical writings from Jews and Romans unanimously agree that Jesus was crucified and died. We get the same testimony from first-generation Christians like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, etc. They also all claim that Jesus was crucified and died. We get the same testimony from second-generation Christians as well, such as Polycarp, Ignatius, Papias, and Clement, who were students of the disciples. These writings agree with what the New Testament writers say about Jesus. And so while these students of the disciples that didn't necessarily know Jesus personally, they can verify that the apostles, the people who did live and walk with him, actually believed and made the claims that they're found in the New Testament. So the next question is, did crucifixion actually kill Jesus? This is very important if you're talking to Muslims because they don't think it actually killed Jesus. Other people believe it pretty easily because all scholars agree with that pretty much, but Muslims wouldn't agree with this. So it's important to understand that it did actually kill Jesus. So what do you guys know about crucifixion? Yeah?
It was the most painful way of torture
Yeah.
and death.
Yeah.
Huh?
Alright, so we have Romans, Jews, and Christians all confirming that Jesus was crucified and died on the cross, and there is no reference that Jesus may have survived crucifixion, at least from early on. Nobody would say that Jesus survived crucifixion because in that time people knew what crucifixion was, and they knew he couldn't survive that. Some people today will say that he might have survived crucifixion, but they don't really know what crucifixion was, and that claim kind of shows they don't really understand how bad crucifixion was. So, before we decide to actually kill Jesus, we're going to look at what crucifixion was and understand the process of that. People during Jesus' time used to say, let no Roman citizen ever hear the word crucifixion because it was so horrific. It is actually where we get the word excruciating from. The Jews were under Roman rule during the time of Jesus. Romans practiced crucifixion as a form of punishment. It made an example of people. Jews would see the bodies on a cross, and it was meant to be a warning of what would happen if you do not obey Rome. The Romans would not crucify their own citizens, though. They used other forms of punishment. The crucifixion was too bad that they wouldn't use it on their own citizens. Oops. So what is the process of crucifixion? So crucifixion begins with flogging. Some writings call this the pre-death. People were flogged with a Roman whip called the cat of nine tails. The whip had about 6 leather cords that came off of it. At the end of the leather cords were leather balls that had shards of bone and metal dumbbells attached to them. When somebody was struck with the whip, the metal dumbbells would cause vasodilation, which is basically their blood vessels are like expanding. It would cause pain receptors to become acute. Blood vessels would dilate, which weakens people even more. The shards of bone would dig into the skin and pull it off. The skin was pulled off and blood would pour out because the metal dumbbells had caused dilation of the blood vessels. During the process of crucifixion or of flogging, it is said sometimes intestines would spill out because the abdominal wall was weakened so much. People sometimes even died during the flogging process. The whole body was flogged. Flogging made it so that people were not able to kick and fight whenever they were being nailed to the cross because they were already so close to death at that point. And people were also flogged and crucified while naked. And after the flogging, the victims would often be forced to carry the crossbeam to the point of the cross. When they reached the place they were to be crucified, they were placed on the cross and nails were driven through their arms and the wrist area. And the medial nerve runs right through that area. It's the main sensory nerve of your hand, so having a nail go through it destroys your hand. And the knees are slightly bent, one ankle is pierced or placed over the other, and a 9-inch nail is driven through the feet. So the purpose of the nail is to allow you to push yourself up to be able to breathe. When you're hanging in the position on the cross by the nails in your wrist, you can't breathe out. So when you're like this, you can't breathe out, you can only breathe in. You have to push up on your feet to be able to exhale. And that's what the nail on your feet is for. It's an additional torture because it prolongs the pain. Otherwise, you would just die because you couldn't breathe. And so it's like an added torture to that. The nail on the feet also made it really easy to see if you were dead or not. Whenever you weren't moving, you weren't breathing, so you were dead. It was pretty simple. But the Roman soldiers wouldn't stop there because if they were wrong about somebody being dead, they would lose their job and even be killed. So they wanted to make sure the victim was actually dead. To do this, they would administer death blows. This is why the knees of the criminals were broken beside Jesus. By breaking their knees, they could no longer push up on their feet to breathe, and so they would die. Jesus had already died, so they pierced him with a spear instead. And when he was pierced with a spear, blood and water were poured out, according to John. The separation of blood and water, or blood and serum, only happens after death, and it's a sign of asphyxiation or cardiac stress. And so by this we also know he was dead because the blood and water were separated. Other death blows included crushing the skull with a sledgehammer, lighting people on fire, etc. So it was pretty violent. So anybody who understands the process of crucifixion knows that you will die by crucifixion. There is no account of anybody in history surviving a full Roman crucifixion. There is one account that Josephus saw 3 of his friends being crucified. They weren't done being crucified, and he asked to get them down immediately. They were taken down. 2 of them died anyway. One of them did survive with the best Roman medical care, but 2 of them ended up dying anyway. But nobody ever has survived a full Roman crucifixion that we have an account of. So what do scholars say on this? Well, scholars, atheists, and agnostics included, all say that he did die by crucifixion. It's pretty unanimous. We're going to look at a few quotes though. John Dominic Crossan, a critical non-Christian scholar and co-founder of Jesus Seminar, which isn't really a Christian seminar, he said that he was crucified, that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical ever can be. Jared Ludeman, who's an atheist New Testament professor, said Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Then Bart Ehrman, another popular atheist New Testament scholar, said one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. So what are some objections to this? Are you guys familiar with any, or have you heard any objections to Jesus actually dying by crucifixion? Yeah?
He didn't die at all according to the Quran.
Yeah.
What's objections mean?
Like things you would say against it. So like things you would say like Jesus actually didn't die because of something. Anything else you guys have heard?
There's always the objection that he never really lived.
Yeah, there's that one. And most, like pretty much like all historical scholars would think that's kind of ridiculous. Like they all know Jesus did exist, he was a real person. Yeah?
Or it could be, they thought it could be Judas on the cross instead of Jesus.
Yeah, it's a Muslim belief, yeah. Okay, so one of the more common ones, which a lot of Muslims believe, is the swoon theory. In this theory, they think that Jesus didn't really die. And again, historically, there's not really any evidence at all that says Jesus survived the crucifixion. People began proposing this theory much later in the 18th century, and it's known as the swoon theory. Skeptics argue that even if Jesus was crucified, maybe he didn't really die. He could have just lost consciousness and appeared to be dead, then later been revived in the tomb and made his way out and presented himself to his disciples as the resurrected Messiah, and then Christianity began. So what do you guys think some problems are with this theory? Yeah? Yeah. And if you just got crucified and barely survived, you couldn't push the rock away, right? Yeah. Yeah. Even like one man by himself probably couldn't push the rock away. Any other problems? Yeah?
If that had happened, he would have been weak, and it would have been obvious to the disciples that he had resurrected.
Right, yeah, that's one of the major problems. Yeah. And so first of all, it doesn't take the details of crucifixion seriously. As we looked at, if you were crucified by Romans, you were going to die. There wasn't really a way around that. Romans were expert executioners, as you said, and they knew what they were doing. Jesus faking his resurrection also goes against everything we know about his moral and ethical ministry. For him to lie about his resurrection goes completely against what he taught all his life. And then one of the major problems with this is, as you said, the Strauss critique, which is when people started proposing this, an atheist named David Strauss wrote a critique. It's now called the Strauss critique. He said the idea that Jesus did not die on the cross is untenable. Not only would Jesus have to break out of the tomb with broken hands and feet and fight the Roman guards around his tomb, which would be virtually impossible for someone who had just survived Roman crucifixion, but he would also have to convince the disciples that he was the risen Lord. But if you have a man who barely survived crucifixion, he doesn't look like the risen Lord. The disciples would be rushing to get him medical attention and nurse him back to health. The fact that he was considered the risen Lord makes it impossible that he just survived crucifixion. And Ava, would you mind reading the quote from David Strauss?
It is impossible that he who had stolen half dead out of the
Sepulchre. That's like a tomb, basically.
Who crept about weak and ill, wanting medical treatment, who required bandaging, strengthening, and indulgence, and who still at last yielded to his sufferings, could have given to the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror of death and the grave, the Prince of Life, an impression which lay at the bottom of their future ministry. Such a resuscitation could only have weakened the impression which he had made upon them in life and death. At the most, could only have given it an elegiac voice, but could by no possibility have changed their sorrow to enthusiasm, have elevated their reverence into worship.
Thank you. So the Strauss critique ended the swoon theory in Western scholarship, and David Strauss was not even a Christian. And again, there is no early evidence or testimony that ever claims Jesus didn't die and that he was only wounded. In addition to this, like we mentioned earlier, it's really easy to tell if you were dead because if you weren't moving, then you weren't able to breathe, and so you were dead. And again, we see the blood and water in John's account, which doesn't happen unless you're dead. And John wouldn't understand what that means medically, but we know now that it only happens after death. All right. So fact 2 is Jesus' followers truly believed the risen Jesus had appeared to them. So historians are convinced that Jesus' followers came to believe that they had seen the risen Jesus, and they have a good reason for it. And just to clarify, they don't believe he actually did, or their followers actually did, at least the atheist and agnostic ones don't, but they do believe they had an experience where they believed they really saw the risen Jesus. All right, so talk with your neighbor for a second, and why do you guys think that historical scholars actually believe this?
I guess, we know at least some of the disciples were
He also several times as well. Like like clearly out. I guess they count like he wasn't there. Another and just like why then you also think about later on that they all were and so this was Jesus didn't be a good were you at that table? I saw you.
Chris. The others, it's plausible that they were. It's just
They
Okay, what are some of y'all's thoughts?
Basically, they saw the disciples in the upper room where after this all happened, the crucifixion, he appeared to them several times. One of those was Thomas didn't believe it at first, and who was one of Jesus' disciples. He said he would not believe that it was Jesus unless he had seen and felt the marks in his hand where the nails had gone through. And later when Jesus appeared, one of those times he spoke to Thomas directly, and Thomas was able to feel and see where those nails went through.
Yeah. Yeah, that was pretty impressive. Yeah, Lydia?
They were willing to die for their belief. They went through extreme torture, most of them. And then they also, the things that they wrote, like, about themselves, they weren't to gain power. Like, they're pretty embarrassing stories. So
Right.
they definitely weren't doing it for, you know, any benefit.
Yeah, they weren't getting anything from it. Okay. So there's a lot of reasons why we believe this. One of them is the proclamation of the resurrection appears very early in church history. 1 Corinthians 15:3-7 is an early Christian creed that is dated very soon after the resurrection of Jesus. Even skeptical scholars agree that it was formed within 3 years of the crucifixion, and other respected scholars such as James Dunn date it within months of Jesus' death on the cross. Either way, this creed was formed very early and was in circulation very early. Grace, will you read it for us?
1 Corinthians 3-7. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles.
Okay, thank you. So what are the implications of the creed? Well, the creed shows us that Christians believed very early on that Jesus did die and did rise from the dead. It also shows that he appeared to people. The creed provides a list of people Jesus appeared to. This is a list of eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus, and since it was so soon after the event, these people were still alive and they could confirm or deny it. And the creed is basically saying you can go and ask these people by giving the names of the people. Also, the resurrection claims begin in Jerusalem. So if somebody was going to start a false rumor about something, they might be able to start one in a place far away where nobody could verify it. But if you start a false rumor, especially one so major like this one, in the place where the rumor is about, it won't last very long. Jerusalem was the hometown of Jesus, and many people in Jerusalem knew Jesus and followed him, and there were a lot of eyewitnesses to the resurrection in Jerusalem. So if people did not actually believe the risen Jesus had appeared to them, the rumor would easily be shut down, and the supposed eyewitnesses would be able to tell them, like, no, we didn't actually see him. And so it would have been shut down very quickly. And also, we could have pulled his body from the tomb to prove that he was still dead if he hadn't been risen from the dead. And there's a lot of eyewitness claims in the Gospels. These are just a few of them. Would you mind reading? I don't know your name. But.
Okay. Acts 10:41. God raised him from the dead on the third day and made him to appear, not to all the people, but to us who had been chosen by God as witnesses, who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. John 21:24. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true.
Okay, thank you. So these passages show that Peter claimed that he and the other eyewitnesses to the resurrection and that they ate and drank with the risen Jesus. And then in John, this is the end of John, but John is basically saying that everything that he wrote in his gospel he was a witness of, and his gospel is all about Jesus' death and resurrection in his life. And so he's saying, I witnessed all of that. And like I said, there's a lot of other claims in the New Testament as well. These are just like a few of the main ones. So another important reason we know this is true is that the disciples were willing to die for this belief. So the disciples were willing to die for the belief that the risen Jesus had appeared to them. And being willing to die for something doesn't make it true, but it does prove that person is sincere and really believes that it's true. Nobody dies for what they know is they lie. Some people will object that Muslim terrorists also die for what they believe is true, but it doesn't make it true. So how would you guys respond to that? What's different about Muslim terrorists dying now versus the disciples dying back then for their belief?
Disciples aren't blowing innocent people up.
That's true. Yeah?
In this case, the people who were dying, like at least on the Christian side, were in a position to be eyewitnesses to the thing that they were believing in. Whereas Muslims today dying, they're removed, well, like 1,400 years from those events.
Right. Yeah. So they're saying, like, they're dying because they're saying, I saw Jesus, I witnessed him, versus I believe this. And even now, like, if we were to die as Christians, we wouldn't die with the same way the disciples did. We would be saying, I believe this, but it wouldn't be like, I saw Jesus face to face. So it's different. And they had that special kind of time there where they actually could die for saying, I saw Jesus. The martyrdoms of various eyewitnesses are found in recorded history. Some examples include Stephen in Acts 7:60, James the brother of John in Acts 12:2, and then Peter in 1 Clement 5:2-7. 1 Clement is not in the New Testament, but it's a letter written by one of the disciples of the disciples. An early church tradition tells us that 10 of the disciples were killed for following Jesus, or 11 if you count Matthias to replace Judas. Then, of course, Jesus committed suicide, and then John was exiled and later died as an old man. And so for these reasons, along with others, the majority of scholars are convinced that Jesus' followers truly believed that he rose from the dead and appeared to them. So what are some objections to the disciples really believing that they saw the risen Jesus? You guys can talk for a second and then we'll answer.
Every single person.
I mean, I know that's an effect of why they were
Regardless of how.
It's kind of refuted right that none of them are. So like not only were so many but none of them were willing to save themselves.
They had some kind of maybe it wasn't that much going on.
Especially like you have one guy who's like crazy, maybe not willing to like.
Well, it sounds stressed.
Like you have that, but then Start having 12 peanut butter and stuff. None of them wanted to save their own skin.
Okay, what are some of y'all's thoughts?
People thought they were crazy.
Yeah. Anything else?
Is it mass hallucination?
Mass hallucination? Yeah.
An imposter, someone who's like impersonating Jesus.
Someone who's what?
Impersonating Jesus.
Okay, yeah. Heard that one, or like he had an evil twin theory where the twin came back. That was pretty funny. Okay. So if you don't know a lot about the details of the resurrection in the early church, the claim the disciples lied about it might sound reasonable, but before we go into the reasons why doesn't work, we're going to watch a quick video just to show like how ridiculous that claim really is.
Participation. Yeah, everyone's here. All 12.
Just double click on the screen.
Oh. Thank you.
Participation. Yeah, everyone's here. All 12. 11. 11 of us. What's the plan?
Well, as you know, Jesus is dead. But stick with me, okay? Stick with me. I have a plan. We are going to steal his body. Okay, I'm tracking with you. What's next? And then we're going to tell the whole world that you rose from the dead.
Oh, you know I'm in.
I love it already.
All right, classic. Then what?
And then we're all going to get brutally murdered.
Wait, come again. Could you go over that last part real quick?
So what? We get murdered. What's the problem?
I like it. I like it. I mean, don't get me wrong, Peach. I love me a good hoax as much as the next guy, right? What's in it for us? Do we all get riches, fame, and fortune first, right?
No, get this. You're going to be hated, persecuted, and reviled for the rest of your life!
Fellas, look, I gotta be missing something here, right? Okay? I mean, why on earth would we do this? Can we start over? Okay, we'll start from the beginning. Everybody, for John, beloved disciple.
So, okay. We go down to Jesus' tomb.
Sounds good, yeah. Really easy.
Then, we pay off the Roman soldiers that are guarding the tomb with their lives.
Why would they do that?
We somehow roll away the big stone that's in front of the tomb.
Obviously, you have to move the rock first. Yeah.
And then we steal his body.
Yeah, I guess.
Then we tell the whole world that he rose from the dead, and we get brutally murdered for our troubles!
Epic break, bro. Okay, guys. Okay, and then what?
Then we all get killed. Come on.
When do we see ourselves become exalted and praised?
That's just it. You don't!
What is happening? Anyone hear what I'm saying? This is the most idiotic plan of all time!
Chill out, bro. I mean, do I really have to explain the joke to you? Look, it's that we lie about Jesus' resurrection, and then we all die.
How am I supposed to chill out when our heads are getting cut off? Or worse, what is wrong with you guys? Thomas! Okay, look, back me up here. I know you can't be cool with all this. I know you gotta have some doubts. Come on.
Doubts?
Oh no, how can you do it?
Okay, okay? I am out of here. I'd rather be exiled to a deserted island than spend another minute with you wackos.
Have I got some good news for you?
We want to thank our friend.
Okay, so again, people don't die for what they know is false. Liars make poor martyrs. And Jesus was crucified for his claims to be God, so his disciples knew if they followed him, it wasn't a great future for them. They were going to face torture, possibly death, which they ended up facing. Most of them did die for their beliefs. But they were well of it. They were aware of this. This is why Peter denied Jesus 3 times when he was taken to be crucified, because he was scared that he was going to be killed for this. But then after the risen Jesus appeared to them, the disciples all boldly proclaimed the resurrection without regard to their own lives or safety. In addition, the disciples didn't have any motive to make this up, as Lydia mentioned earlier. We don't have any reason to think they were lying. When detectives investigate crimes, the motives they look for are financial greed, sexual or relational desire, and pursuit of power. These are the underlying motives for nearly every crime or conspiracy. So we're going to look at each of these and see if it could have possibly motivated the disciples or not. Also, it is almost 8, so if anybody needs to leave, you're welcome to leave. Probably will be about 20 minutes longer. Okay. So first of all, did financial greed motivate the disciples? So we have many accounts describing the lives of the apostles. None of the texts describe the disciples as men who possessed material wealth. The disciples are repeatedly described as men who were chased from location to location, continually abandoning whatever property they owned and vacating whatever homes they were borrowing. The disciples were used to living this way. They made the decision to leave their homes and families when they first started following Jesus. In Luke 18:28, Peter tells Jesus, "We have left our homes and followed you." The disciples rejected material wealth and believed that the truth of the gospel provided eternal life, something way more valuable. Paul often described their impoverished financial condition and reminded his listeners that the apostles were both hungry and thirsty, and poorly clothed, and roughly treated and homeless, which is in 1 Corinthians 4:11. The Christian lifestyle during this time was not at all something that would attract somebody who was looking for wealth. If it was their motive to make up a lie, it didn't work at all. The apostles gained nothing financially from their testimony about Jesus. All of the non-biblical accounts related to the lives of the apostles also confirm the poverty of the apostles. The apostles often left more comfortable lives for lives of poverty in order to spread the gospel. Our next motive is sex or relationships. We also don't have any reason to think this motivated the apostles either. Peter was already married, as were some of the other apostles. Peter's marriage is recorded in Matthew and Paul's writings, and then Paul, along with some other early church fathers, suggests that many of the other apostles were also married, so a lot of them didn't really have anything to gain in this area. Also, adultery was viewed very bad from a Christian standpoint. The New Testament writers confirmed this, that it's very wrong. So Christianity isn't really something that would attract somebody who was looking for sex or a relationship. And also, the apostles only allowed men to rise to leadership in the church if they limited themselves to one wife. So there was polygamy in that time, but if you were going to be a church leader, you could only have one wife. So again, this motive doesn't really work. Our last motive is power. Power was never really available to the apostles. The early Christian movement immediately faced hostility from those who did actually possess power in the first century. Rumors quickly spread that the Christians practiced rituals that often offended Roman sensibilities and were unwilling to worship the Emperor Nero as divine. And Tacitus records Nero's response in this next slide. Will you read this one for us? On the front row.
Consequently, to get rid of them, or Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their ambitions called Christians by the populace. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths, covered with the skins of the beasts. They were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when the daylight had expired.
Thank you. So Tacitus, that we looked at earlier, was, again, not a Christian, but he tells us about the persecution, hatred, torture, and death that Christians faced. Being a leader in the Christian community was a liability and a huge risk. It wasn't at all an asset to them. So prominent leaders who admitted their allegiance to Jesus and refused to recant were the first to die. And it was during this time that Peter and Paul were executed in Rome. Non-biblical histories and writings related to the lives and ministries of the 12 apostles also consistently proclaim that the apostles were persecuted and eventually killed for their testimony. The apostolic eyewitnesses refused to change their testimony about what they saw, even when facing unimaginable torture and execution. John is the only one who appears to have escaped martyrdom, but he was exiled and still persecuted for his faith. So as the apostles rose to positions of leadership, they made themselves a target of persecutions and abuse. The more prominent they became, the more they risked death at the hands of the adversaries. So the early Christians did not gain any power, and they knew and personally experienced that believing in Jesus could cost them their lives. We should also look at what Jesus taught about power to understand what the disciples would believe about power at that point. Would you mind reading one of the passages, the first one?
John 13:12-15. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you.
Thank you. So washing feet is a job that was reserved for like the lowest servant in the house. And Jesus was commanding his disciples to wash feet, which is basically saying you have to humble yourselves and serve others, put yourself lower. Do you want to read our next one, please? Oh, you're good, sorry.
All right, Mark 10:42-45. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many."
Thank you. So again, if they wanted power, they probably wouldn't follow Jesus when he said these things. And if anything, the disciples actually lost power. People like Paul, a very promising Jewish religious leader, and Luke, a doctor, they had influence before, and they were well respected before, but then they became Christians and they lost a lot of that power and respect. So we really don't have any good reason to believe the New Testament writers were making up lies. They had nothing to gain and ended up losing just about everything, even their lives, while continuing to profess their beliefs in Jesus. So the best conclusion is that they were telling the truth, that they really did believe the resurrected Jesus had appeared to them. And some people will claim that the disciples stole the body of Jesus, and that the tomb was empty, but this evidence also shuts that claim down. If they stole the body, then they wouldn't really believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and they wouldn't be willing to die for that belief. So the argument that disciples stole the body cannot account for this, and it also doesn't account for the post-resurrection appearances. And atheists and skeptical scholars also agree. Gary Ludeman admits it may be taken historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. And again, he's not a Christian. Okay, and then our final fact is people who are not followers of Jesus truly believe that risen Jesus had appeared to them. So can you guys think of some examples of people who didn't believe in Jesus before the resurrection and afterwards they became Christians and followed him?
And the Pharisees, some of the Pharisees, right? Some of the people who hated Jesus.
Like Nicodemus, I think, was one of the Pharisees that probably followed Jesus, I think, afterwards. There's two big ones. Yeah?
Paul and James.
Yeah, those are the two I'm talking about. So our first one is Paul. He is one of the most well-known examples. He was originally known as Saul of Tarsus. And during Jesus' lifetime, Paul was a student of Rabban Gamliel, who was one of the most influential teachers of the Oral Torah, which is the Old Testament Jewish religious book. And according to tradition, Gamliel was the grandson of the great Jewish teacher Hillel, the founder of the House of Hillel, the school of Jewish thought. Paul had a lot going for him as a Jew. He began persecuting Christians and had the authority and zeal to arrest them and preside over their executions. But something happened to Paul, which led him to join those he persecuted, even giving up his high Jewish rank and position. According to Paul, the risen Jesus appeared to him. In the book of Acts, Luke records Paul sharing his testimony 3 times, where he makes it clear that he converted on account of having seen the risen Jesus. Paul testifies of this reason himself in 1 Corinthians 15. For this proclamation that he had seen the risen Jesus, he was flogged with lashes 5 times, beaten with rods 3 times, and stoned until assumed dead, and ultimately beheaded. Paul had many chances to give up his mind, or to give up his stance, or to repent, but he gave up everything, including his life, testifying that he had personally seen the risen Jesus. And we also have James, the brother of Jesus. Before the resurrection, he did not believe in Jesus as the Savior, the Messiah. In Mark's Gospel, we find Jesus' brothers coming to collect Jesus because they thought he was out of his mind. And in John's Gospel, Jesus' brothers taught him in such that the Gospel says not even his brothers believed him, in John 7:3-5. And then whenever Jesus was being crucified, his brothers didn't come to support him, and their mother had to be entrusted to John's care instead, which is found in John 19:26-27. But then after the resurrection, we see James and Jesus' brothers being counted among the believers in Acts 1:14. Lydia, would you read that for us?
Yes. Acts 1:13-14. When they arrived, they went upstairs to the room where they were staying. Those present were Peter, John, James, and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James, son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas, the son of James. They all joined together constantly in prayer, along with the woman and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers.
Thank you. And the creed we read earlier from 1 Corinthians 15 tells us why they did this, because the risen Jesus had appeared to James in verse 7. And James became a leader in the church in Jerusalem before being executed by the high priest. And 4 ancient sources that we have report the execution of James, the brother of Jesus, including Josephus. So what do we know about the resurrection? Well, when looking at the life of Jesus, we can be very confident of these 3 things. Jesus died by crucifixion, his followers truly believed the risen Jesus had appeared to them, and the people who were not followers of Jesus also truly believed Jesus had appeared to them after he died. So as we mentioned earlier, the job of a historian is to look at all the data, consider the possibilities, and seek to determine which scenario best explains the data. So what are some possible explanations of these 3 facts? Or things that you've heard, you don't have to believe them. Yeah?
There isn't a simulation and all of this is a lie anyway.
That is a possibility. I've heard that once before. Anything else? Yeah?
I think the hallucination theory is the most popular.
Yeah.
Historians.
Yeah, that's a common one. So I've listed some of the most common theories up here, but whenever we go through them, most of these explanations don't actually fit the facts, and they do strain some of the data or ignore some of the data. We went over the swoon theory already, but again, it doesn't work because, for one, people die from crucifixion. There's no way to really survive a full Roman crucifixion. But also, it was very easy to tell if you were dead or not. And then even if he had survived, he wouldn't be able to convince his disciples that he was the risen Jesus after he just barely survived crucifixion. The 2 other main theories people propose is that the disciples hallucinated the risen Jesus, or that the resurrection is just a legend. So did the disciples hallucinate the risen Jesus? What do you guys think? How would you guys respond to this if somebody told you they just hallucinated? Yeah?
It doesn't explain Paul and James very well.
Right.
Because there's no reason.
Right, yeah. Yes?
What reason do you have for thinking that it was a hallucination?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay. So this theory doesn't work for a couple reasons. For one, the percentage of recipients is way too high. There are several different modes of hallucinations, which are seeing, hearing, feeling, etc. Studies of hallucinations have shown that about 50% of senior adults grieving the loss of a loved one experience a hallucination of some sort. So this might be just like hearing somebody's voice or hearing their footsteps or something like that. Only 7% is a visual hallucination. And senior adults are also in the category that's most likely to experience these hallucinations. So only 7% experience a visual hallucination, but in all the reports we have, it says that all of the disciples saw Jesus, which would mean 100%, which is an unthinkable percentage, rather than just the mere 7 we would expect. And they also are not senior adults, they're pretty young men. So the percentage is way too high. Also, in the earliest Christian accounts, we have appearances of Jesus to groups. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15, we have 3 individual appearances and 3 group appearances. To the 12, a group of over 500 people, and to all the apostles. And we also have appearances in the Gospels as well. But hallucinations are private occurrences in the mind of an individual. They have no external referent. Like with dreams, as Michael Kona explains in one of his talks, you can't have a dream and invite somebody to join that dream with you. You have a personal dream in your own mind. So they occur in the mind of individuals, and you can't ask somebody to join you in your hallucination. It's individual, there's nothing internally going on, it's just all in your mind, and so you can't share them. They don't happen in groups. But we have group appearances of Jesus. Yeah?
Where did you get the source for the 500 people? I've heard that, but I don't know where it's from.
That's in the 1 Corinthians
Still in
creed.
1
Yeah, 1
Corinthians.
Corinthians 15. Yeah. There's another, I forget, one of the Gospels mentions that Jesus also appeared to a lot of people. So we think it's like that appearance. The Gospel doesn't say how many people, but it says a lot of people, a large number. Hallucinations also don't account for Paul's conversions. So Paul was not grieving Jesus. He wasn't sad about his death. He was pretty happy he died and didn't expect to see him again. But Paul did witness the risen Jesus as well. And also something I was looking at last night, hallucinations, if you try to interact with them when you're grieving like a loved one and you hallucinate them, it goes away. Usually you can't interact with them. But the disciples, they talked to Jesus, they ate with him, drank with him, that kind of stuff. But in hallucinations, you can't interact with them. They just kind of disappear if you try to interact with them. Hallucinations also don't account for the empty tomb. And scholars do agree in the tomb. Yeah?
Oh, one thing, just going back a slide.
Sure.
Paul also reported being blind for a week, right?
True, yes.
And so, unless he was tripping for a week straight, then
True.
It doesn't account for that either.
Yeah, that's a good point. So scholars do agree the tomb was empty for multiple reasons. For one, the Roman soldiers were guarding it with their lives. We also have the women's testimony. In that time, women's testimony was not valuable and they weren't considered reliable witnesses. To include, so in the Gospels, they include the women saw the tomb first. And so you wouldn't put that unless it was actually true. You wouldn't ever add that just to make your story look good, because it would make your story look very bad to have women seeing the tomb first. Then as we mentioned earlier, we also know the disciples didn't steal the body because they did really believe Jesus had risen from the dead, and they were willing to die for that, which they wouldn't have been if they just stole the body and made up the lie about it. And also, if the body was still there, the Jewish leaders could quickly end the rumors by just bringing out the body and parading it around town and showing everybody he's still dead. And they wanted to get rid of Christians, so they could have just put his body out there and ended the rumors really quickly, but they didn't have the body to do that. Oops. So our next theory is a legend. And the early date of the Corinthians Creed rules out the possibility of myth or legendary development as a plausible explanation, and demonstrates the disciples begin proclaiming Jesus' death and resurrection and post-resurrection appearances very early. And Christian philosopher and theologian J.P. Moreland explains why that matters so much. Will you read that? I know you're Lydia's brother. What's your name?
Linus.
Okay.
There was simply not enough time for a great deal of myth and legend to occur and distort the historical facts in any significant way. In this regard, an Shorenlight scholar of ancient Roman and Greek history at Oxford has studied the rate at which the legend accumulated in the ancient world. Using the writings of Herodotus as a test case, he argues that even a span of 2 generations is not sufficient for a legend to wipe out a solid core of historical facts. The picture of Jesus in the New Testament was established well within that length of time.
Thank you. Since the resurrection was proclaimed so early, eyewitnesses were still around when the resurrection was being proclaimed, and if the eyewitnesses didn't actually believe what they saw, these rumors would be easily shut down. But instead we have lots of eyewitness accounts in the New Testament, and there could be no eyewitnesses if it was just a legend. So the only explanation that actually fits all of these facts and doesn't strain the data is the resurrection, that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Are there any questions?
About this or anything else?
Alright, if not, that's it. Thank you guys for coming. You guys are free to hang out and talk afterwards.